So my name is Rebecca, and I work for the Innovative Farmers Programme at the Soil Association, and here we're here this evening to talk about the topic of perennial green manures, which we've collaborated with a few really expert sort of people in this area, including Chloe, who will be speaking a bit later about the PhD and the work which they've been doing in Wales on perennial green manures, and also Emma Maxwell on her experiences in her market garden. But a quick intro to field labs as well, because part of this session is to assess whether or not there might be interest and scope to run what we call a field lab on the topic of perennial green manures. And I'll just move to the next slide. So field labs, it's a term which we use in Innovative Farmers to basically describe a bunch of on-farm trials, usually one field lab, which might be on the topic, for example, of perennial green manures, would be trialled at multiple farms, maybe on the same crops, perhaps on different crops in different locations across the UK. But the point is getting farmers and growers together to trial the same topic and to speed up learnings and innovation around it. You'd get dedicated support from a coordinator and a researcher. And we can help match you up with those people that could help with things like data collection, just general project managing the field lab, providing opportunities for discussion, and we can also help to arrange on-farm events, on-farm walks, that kind of thing, or useful online sessions as well to discuss the topic and the learnings of the field labs. And also we have good links with the local, regional, niche and national farming media to get the results out as best we can. All of the results of field labs are available through our website, and everything is open source so that you can learn from the trials. Since the programme launched in 2012, we have awarded small grants so that groups can look into the research topics that are important to them. So with the priority that we are, with the focus of prioritising ideas from farmers and growers rather than what you might be told as the right solutions to be practicing on your own site. So we've launched over 150 field labs since 2012. Collaborated with, to be honest, well over 40 organisations. I do need to update the figure, I think, on that. And we've had around about 750 trialists working together to share knowledge from the field labs. So just a very quick run through of a few current field labs. At any time, we have about 20 field labs on the go or slightly more. But ones that I thought might be relevant, there's quite a few horticultural field labs, and I've also included a few on there more in the arable sector. That includes topics like wireworm control, but using biofumigant crops to see how well they might suppress the pest. We've been looking into living mulches in blackcurrants for weed control, and that's ongoing. In Cornwall, a group of growers looking into compost management techniques, so comparing things like turning and covering and seeing how that affects yield and soil health and pathogens and weed seeds as well. Also, we've just launched a trial in Scotland on peat-free propagation, trying to find using hot composting, but also comparing some different mixes to see how well they can perform compared to peat alternatives. Right, that's all I need to discuss about field labs for now. I think Tilly will be sharing some more information in the chat about how you could get involved in a field lab on the topic that we're here to discuss today. But without further ado, I will hand over to Chloe for your bit.
So
And I'll
I will
show you my screen.
share my screen. Is that doing it?
Yep, that's
Yeah.
perfect. Oh, you've just got out of it again.
Yeah, I can see the presentation, but I can't see any of you. But that's okay, I think. So, okay. So I'm gonna give a little bit of background about the Perennial Green Manure project and explain the technique and the kind of things we might research in a farmer lab. So just to explain our project, our current project, which myself and Tilly work for, is through Eco Dovey, based in the Dovey Valley in beautiful mid Wales. And we're researching perennial green manures on a small scale, and I'm the researcher and Tilly's the project manager. So we'd really like people to think today about the kind of the theories behind the technique and whether they think they're actually a good idea and whether it's worth researching it further. I'm going to explain what the technique is and why and what we're doing. So just a very basic slide to start with. So this is the system. So perennial green manures are when you grow a mix of trees and shrubs and other plants in a permanent area, and you cut the leaves and you add them to your cropland to fertilise the crops. Now, the permanent area, which we call a bioservice area, would include a mix of nitrogen-fixing plants and nitrogen-lifting plants. But it's a fantasy at the moment. We haven't actually done it yet. I've planted a bioservice area a couple of years ago, but at the moment we're just trying to see whether this method of fertilising actually works. And it came about from some research I took part in Bangor University, and I'd been an organic gardener for quite a long time. But the research at Bangor University was addressing the issues of nitrogen use in agriculture and the detrimental impact of nitrogen. And there's a couple of papers there that you can access, and I think Tilly can put those links in the chat later as well. So this is the background of the situation. There's something that we call the nitrogen problem. And this is that there's no way of supplying nitrogen now that is entirely free of environmental problems. So this chart shows a comparison between traditional green manures, like clover that you sow in your cropland and then you dig in for the following crop, and industrially produced fertiliser. So there's various pros and cons of each. So obviously, industrial produced fertiliser has a big carbon cost in its production. It uses a lot of energy to fix that nitrogen. Whereas green manures are using sunlight energy, so that's all good. Green manures also add organic matter to the soil, which is brilliant and keeps the systems going healthily, and feeds all the soil animals, and it's a much healthier system than just drip feeding with industrially produced ammonium or nitrate. But then in the last two rows come some more problematic things, because if you're growing your green manures and fixing your nitrogen in rotation, it's not very flexible on how you can add that nitrogen. Whereas if you're using just a powder or a prill and you're quite a well-behaved inorganic farmer, then ideally you would add that nitrogen little bits throughout the season so you don't get too much nitrogen building up in the soil. But if you've just got a big stand of clover, then it's hard to get that. It's hard to add it as and when it's needed by the crop. And then on the last line is that to grow your nitrogen using green manures, it takes up land. Whereas if you're buying in inorganic nitrogen, there's no land requirement. I mean, that land can be environmentally beneficial. Those layers are great for wildlife, but we're trying to think of ways that maybe it could be more beneficial. So just to go through the problem with the supply of nitrogen, this is our agricultural system, and in the green box is where the nitrogen is in the crops and the plants. In the lower left box, it's in the organic matter and the animals and the soil. And in the lower right box, it's the mineral nitrogen. And what we don't want is these red arrows, the nitrous oxide, the ammonia being emitted, and the leaching. So if you're adding nitrogen, which has been industrially fixed in that right blue arrow, it's been taken out of the air, been made into a fertiliser, and it goes straight into that soil mineral nitrogen pool. And from there, if you've got too much, it can be leached away, and it can be emitted as greenhouse gases. Whereas if you're adding it via legumes, so fixed by the left blue arrow into your leguminous crops or your leguminous green manures, and then it's in the tissue of the green manures, it's added to the soil, it feeds all the soil animals, and they convert it to the ammonium and the nitrate, which are the chemicals that can be taken up by the crops. But the problem is, just like that inorganic nitrogen, you want to add the right amount at the right time. So if you're adding a great big amount of organic nitrogen, you can get mineral nitrogen building up. So we want more flexible systems so that we can control that a bit better. And then, so this graph on the left with the nitrous oxide emissions, that's showing that it's a biggie. Nitrous oxide is a big subject that we want to address because it's almost a third of the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. It's bigger than machinery use or any other carbon emissions. And as we decarbonise other aspects of society, it will become a bigger proportion of our environmental greenhouse gas impact. So we think nitrous oxide is a good one to concentrate on. And then the graph on the right, that's showing the other part of this issue. So each square there is 1 million hectares within the UK landscape. So you can see what we're doing with it all. So if you look at the orange and yellow squares, that's 5 million hectares of cropland. And what we've got is 2.5 grown food to feed ourselves and 2.5 grown fodder for livestock. And most of that at the moment is being fertilised by industrially produced nitrogen, with all the environmental impacts of that. But what we need is more green squares. We need more forests. Land's in high demand. But if we were to fertilise those 5 yellow and orange squares with lays in rotation, that would mean approximately doubling the land area, because even if you're using your nitrogen really carefully, you still need to put down land to these lays. So most farms, if they're not supplying nitrogen, if they're not bringing it into the farm from elsewhere, half their land is under these nitrogen fixing lays all the time. So that's that land use argument. And then we're coming on to our kind of potential embryo of a solution for some of this. So here's a field of crops, cabbages or something, and then this is what happens at the moment. You'll need another area about the same size in rotation, with the nitrogen being fixed in the nodules in the soil, and then you'll swap those over and provide nitrogen. What we're thinking is maybe you can do this instead. So instead of having that lower ground cover, you could have a 3-dimensional system where you've got trees and shrubs, so you've got a lot more habitat, you'd have unploughed land, so the carbon's building up in the soil and in the trees and the shrubs, and you're also able to add the nitrogen bit by bit as you need it for the crop. And so we're thinking this is a potential solution. Of course, this is very blocky. In reality, you'd design your landscape, to fit in with the environment. So you might have your bioservice areas We're calling them bioservice areas because we like to think that they can provide lots of different services for agriculture and the environment. So some might double up as windbreaks, shelter breaks, like in the middle of that picture there. Some might be down in the floodplain and they could intercept leachates, which would be returned in the leaves. Some might be on the hillside. So you could situate them away from your prime cropping lands, so saving space. So it's really important to remember that the nitrogen's in the leaves. So, because it's a bit confusing with these systems, because we all know that nitrogen's fixed in the nodules, by the bacteria in the roots of plants, but then that nitrogen's put into the leaves, and then it's those green leaves which are cut and added to the cropland. So you've got to harvest the leaves in summer. So if you're harvesting tree leaves, it's a bit like trimming a hedge. If you're harvesting herbaceous plants in between, then it's like mowing grass or cutting comfrey or whatever plant you're using. So then I just put this slide in because most small-scale growers I know are using composts or animal manures, which is often a good system. But we're trying to look at potential solutions for a very big scale. So the main reason we can't use animal manure for all of UK production is that there wouldn't be enough. And it's important to kind of follow back the nitrogen of where it actually came from in the animal manure. So it's not made within an animal. It's doing something weird. The green manure, the nitrogen isn't made within the animal. It comes from the food that the animal has eaten. And so that nitrogen has either been fixed organically by clovers it's eaten, or it's been fixed industrially by the fodder it's eaten. In the worst case scenario, that nitrogen might have been imported from other countries where it's been fixed industrially. So we might be importing the nitrogen in that way. So it doesn't actually work out in the cycle if you're just using animal manure, because you need to place the nitrogen in the setting where it's come from. So I'm a bit behind time, so I should speed up. But this is what we did initially at Bangor University. So we were looking at 3 different nitrogen fixing plants and whether they could actually fertilise crops and what the implications of that would be. Compared to traditional green manure, clover, and compared to inorganic nitrogen. I mean, now we're thinking much more broadly and thinking of nitrogen lifters as well as fixers. So there's all sorts of plants that you can use as perennial green manures, all sorts of vetches, lupins, broom, laburnums, loads of things, lifters like grasses and Jerusalem artichokes or willows, all sorts of things. But what we did at Bangor is we collected leaves of alder, the nitrogen fixing tree, gunnera, the big rhubarb-like thing, also a nitrogen fixer, and gorse. We collected the leaves and we fertilised, mixed it with soil and grew crops. And what we found is that they did fertilise the crops, and we got very good results in terms of environmental impact because there was a slower release of nitrogen from these perennial green manures, and so the nitrates didn't build up in the soil and there was much lower nitrous oxide emissions. Whereas with the clover, used in the traditional way, there was really quite high nitrous oxide emissions. And this can happen if you have quite a warm, wet environment. That's not to say that clover is always bad and that if you add clover you'll get high nitrous oxide emissions, because clover can also be used as a perennial green manure, which we're doing now. So you're cutting the leaves and adding it bit by bit to supply the nitrogen in the quantities needed for the crop. Whereas in this research, we added quite a lot at the very beginning of the season, like you would if you're using a traditional green manure. So coming on to what myself and Tilly are doing now, this is a much less scientific project, but much more about practicalities and the experience for the growers. So we collected leaves of the perennial green manures and we're trialling them on 6 farms, and we're going to write up the results in a report that we'll release in the spring. So what we did is we got the local growers to choose what crop they wanted to experiment on, and we chose perennial green manures that we thought would supply nutrients well to that crop. So we usually used a mix of them, one slow release like alder and one faster release like clover or like comfrey, but added just a little bit just when the crops need it, so that you fertilise the crops and you don't build up the nitrogen in the soil too much. And we compared that with their own additions. So these are some of the results so far. So one thing we found is that, because we measured the nitrogen within the inputs we were putting in and also in what they're normally using, we found that a lot of organic growers are adding a great deal of nitrogen in their composts or their manures, because, I mean, you don't know. It's not like a packet with it written on. You don't know how much you're adding, so you do it by sight or judgment for your wheelbarrows. But we found that often they're adding over 800 kilograms per hectare equivalent. Whereas with the perennial green manures, we were quite restrained. We tried to keep it under 200 kilogram per hectare equivalent. But we had some interesting results. So surprisingly, willow seems to be doing very well to willow leaves. Green willow leaves is doing well to fertilise a crop of beetroot. We're not quite sure why that is. But it's interesting. Willow's got lots of interesting properties. And in a crop of early potatoes, we found alder and clover did help fertilise them, but they were being compared with a much greater amount of nitrogen within manure, which did much better. So it might be that if we added a larger quantity of the PGMs, it could work well. And we need to do some more experimenting with that. Those previous ones, if you're scientifically minded, you'll notice there's no error bars, so we didn't often replicate the plots unless we had the space, but this is one that we did, and this is Emma's trial, and she can talk a little bit more about that later, because I'm going to go over time if I'm not careful. But an interesting thing about Emma's trial is that her idea was to try fresh grass as well, and grass actually did really well as a perennial green manure, mowing it from the lawn areas and putting it straight onto mulch mix of potatoes. It did pretty much as well as her usual manure. And we're waiting for results to come in from kale experiments, which we're hoping should be good because it's a nice long-term crop, so it gives the PGMs a chance to work a bit better. So I hope that's making sense so far. I just want to come back to the key issues behind the technique. So the one is that you're adding that nitrogen bit by bit. It's within the leaves of the PGMs, and you're adding it as and when needed by the crop. If we can build up information on other nutrient contents like phosphorus and potassium, then we could also perhaps address other soil issues by carefully adding the right species. The other issue is the land use issue. So it'd be great to hear what people think about that, because there's arguments against this kind of technique. So farmers who use inorganic nitrogen, they might argue that it's actually better not to put any land down to green manures at all, and to spare that land and plant it up with forests and carry on with industrial fixed nitrogen. That might be an argument that would be used. I mean, organic growers wouldn't agree with that, but that's what a lot of people would say. And then from the other side of it, I'd love to hear it from farmers who use lays at the moment, use lays in rotation, because I know a lot of growers see that as a crucial thing for their soil health. So would it be okay to, instead of having rotational lays, have permanent areas somewhere else to fix the nitrogen? Or would that be detrimental to soil health at all? Or would the fact that you can add organic matter from the bioservice areas make up for that? So it'd be nice to hear any thoughts on those. But if we do decide that perennial green manure systems are a good idea, worth researching further, and we want to run a field lab, then these are some of the things we could look at, like the design of the systems. Like, so for example, if we had an alley type cropping system, you'd be able to, that's my alarm telling me to shut up. You'd be able to move the perennial green manure straight onto the land, fresh, or you could have separate bioservice areas and dry and transport the leaves easily. A lot of our participants said how nice it was that the leaves were really nice and light because we dried them compared to moving manure or compost around. You could use, there's various issues to solve with if you're actually going to use the tree leaves, that, you know, so that you don't disturb the wildlife when you're harvesting them, so that you don't have too much carbon in with it if you've got stems in them. So there's issues like that to look at. And then there's all sorts of other exciting things that would be nice to know, like, say, potassium and phosphorus content of these different species, the effects on the soil chemistry, the pH, the soil fauna, what would happen if you did it year after year after year, because there's evidence from Bangor that it's increasingly beneficial each year that you do it, carbon sequestration and all sorts of other things, policy to look at. I think this is my last slide. So then we were just thinking about a couple of possible farmer labs, like maybe, so topics for farmer labs looking at the production of the perennial green manures, how much you can produce per unit area, the nutrient contents, that kind of thing, or then just trying it on good large-scale fields, crops, because so far our growers are quite small-scale horticulturalists. It'd be great to see what it was like to use a large quantity of PGMs on a large scale. Look at that. And I think that's my next slide is back to Emma. I don't know if I unshare my screen. Stop sharing.
Sorted. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, thank you, Chloe. We've got a whole host of questions in the chat, which we'll come on to, and I'm sure if there's anything we miss out, we can always address it after the webinar. As I've already said before, this meeting is being recorded, so hopefully you're all happy to be recorded. Otherwise, please turn off your camera, and we will be sending the recording around afterwards as well. So for those slides that you've seen, if you like to view them, it will be available later. On to Emma.
Hello, yes, I'm Emma. I've got a market garden in Mid Wales in Llanidloes, and I was asked to take part in this trial, and I was very keen to do so because it's perennial crops, which makes sense. And I had previously done an innovative farmers trial on mulches, and everyone at that time was interested in trialling ramial wood chip. And I said, well, can I do this trial with grass cuttings? So for that trial, that was just as COVID was kicking off, I did a field of kale, a duplicate trial, and I used wood chip and biodegradable mulches and grass cuttings. And the reason I was keen on using the grass cuttings is because we're a market garden, we're open to the public, we've got lots of grass paths, and we cut the grass. And if we just mulch it because it's quicker where we're cutting it, but if we gather it up, we've been mulching it onto beds. And I'd been using this a lot in the perennial gardens around trees and shrubs, laying down cardboard, putting some grass cuttings on, and basically making compost on the beds. And it worked really well as a weed suppressant. So on that trial, I was really using it, thinking it was a good weed suppressant, and hadn't really considered how much nitrogen was being given off to the crop. So with the previous trial with the kale, I didn't put cardboard underneath the grass because obviously it was an annual crop. There wasn't a lot of room. So it was just one dressing of grass cuttings. And the results of that trial were amazing. The yield in the kale was far heavier than with any of the other mulches that we used. So when this trial came up a few years later, I jumped at it and said, yes, I'd be really interested in looking at perennial green manures and how they can affect the crop. And the fact that Chloe and Tilly were measuring the nitrogen in the inputs and things as well really interested me. Then it was open for me to choose whatever crop I wanted to grow. And after doing the kale crop and weighing the kale yield every week for 20 weeks, I went for a nice easy crop that was just harvested once and only had to be weighed once. So we did it on the main crop, potatoes. And again, we got interesting results. Chloe can bring up the slide again of the results from my plots. But the grass cutting mulch gave really good results. So it was really good to compare it with the perennial green manures that Chloe and Tilly had been working on. That's it, that one there. But at the end of this trial, I'm left with thinking I would really like to do it again because we only got water onto my site a couple of years ago, and so the potato crop wasn't irrigated at all during this trial. And literally from the moment we planted the potatoes, it didn't rain for at least 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, which meant that there was some soil moisture, but of course the perennial green manures were in pelleted or dried form. And my thoughts was they weren't really activated until we got a downpour of rain. And I think that will have affected the results of the trial. So I'd like to do it again with an irrigated crop so that it might show up different results. We have actually now got dug in water pipes to the field so we can irrigate it in future years. But the main thing for me with the results of this trial that came out was it's really obvious that if you don't add anything to your potato crop, you're going to get a poor yield. So the control that had no inputs at all was disastrous. Then most people use manure with potatoes, and as we expected, the yield for the manure was pretty good. The variation bars I thought were interesting on this slide because the manure, there was less variation, and I suppose it's a more tried and tested method of feeding your crops. But I think those variation bars would be different if the crop had been irrigated and the soil moisture would have been more even around the beds and things like that. So basically that was good, really good results. I was really pleased with the grass cutting results. I was really pleased with the alder and clover results. At the end of it, my thinking is for me on my plot, because we got the grass plastered, it's really easy to gather the grass. And obviously it's not just grass, it's a grass clover ley mix. So what we've been looking at going forward perhaps for next year is I wanted to look at another crop that I could easily mow and just collect on a grass cutting collection box. So we're looking at planting a crop of comfrey. And I wasn't over keen on planting comfrey because it spreads and goes everywhere. But we've got an area where we can put it right in the middle of a field, so we can mow round it and keep it contained. So we'll be looking at doing clover as a mode, and then put it on as a mulch. The tree leaf mulches I think are great, but it's how to easily gather those in and process them for use. But what really impressed me with what Chloe and Tilly are doing is that these pellets look just the same as a fertiliser that you could go and buy from your local farm shop, like chicken manure pellets. Now we're moving into an era of veganism being really strong, and people don't want to use chicken pellets. They don't want to have a byproduct from massive chicken farms. Chloe's already mentioned we don't want to be using traditional chemical nitrogen fertilizer either. So as an alternative for a pelleted fertilizer that people could buy, I think it's got a lot for it. And I think if we can think of a way of mechanising gathering in the material so that it's viable to financially to turn it into the pellets. You can see the picture of the pellets there. The pellets are familiar for people. They can measure a handful of pellets. They know how much they're applying. So it's recordable, it's saleable. And yeah, probably if you found someone with a massive budget to fund it and make it into a business, I think it has got a lot of potential. I don't know what else I'm supposed to be saying.
That's brilliant, Emma. I think I forgot to explain about the pellets, but we had them made from the alder leaves and the clover leaves by Aberystwyth University. And for non-organic gardeners, they would be great, or larger scale farmers. They could be used like a fertiliser prill, and could essentially could persuade a lot of people to move from an inorganic to organic.
Brilliant. Oh, well, thank you very much, Emma and Chloe. Should we move on to the discussion section now? There's quite a few questions in the chat. Some of them have been answered by Tilly and Chloe as we've gone along, but there's a few more. So if I just read them out, everyone's happy, and then Chloe and Emma and Tilly, if you can just give some comments on them or answer, that would be great. We had one from Andy who's interested in whether nitrogen is lost into the atmosphere when green manures are destroyed on warm days. I think you've answered it a bit, Chloe, but it's just worth discussing.
So I mean that's it. It's an issue with anything nitrogen rich you add to the soil. So there's two different routes you can lose. Well, there's a few different routes you can lose nitrogen to the atmosphere. So the one we really, really don't want is the nitrous oxide. It accounts for a small amount of the nitrogen, but because it's such a powerful greenhouse gas, and that happens when the soil is warm and wet. But another one that I think Andy might have been talking about is ammonia volatilisation, which is often, you get a lot of that from heaps of manure. And you don't get it when the nitrogen source is dug into the soil, but if it's on the surface, and especially if it's wet, you can get volatilisation. So I did some experiments on that at Bangor, where I trapped the gas and measured ammonia, trapped as ammonium. I won't go into the details, but it didn't appear to be a problem in my initial experiments. I can't see why it'd be more of a problem with perennial green manures than other things. It tends to happen from urine and from manure more. So as far as I know, it's less of an issue than with other nitrogenous compounds.
Okay, thank you. Just worth pointing out as well, Ryan's pointed out that gunner is listed as an invasive species in the UK,
Yeah.
and Chloe pointed out they have actually you've dropped it from the trial now. Because
it's such a shame, but the gunner experts are re-evaluating the different species and how they classify them. So the Gunnera I used, which I thought was Gunnera tinctoria, and they've now reclassified, they think, as a new hybrid. and they're yet to decide if this new hybrid is invasive or not. It was thought that Tinctoria was invasive and Manicata wasn't, but it's more complicated than that. And I've got some recent papers on Gunnera. There's a Gunnera expert in Ireland I've been talking to, but we've had to put it on the back burner for now, which is a shame.
It's a shame. Which species of willow did you use in the trial, Chloe?
We don't know because they hybridise so easily. Even the willow experts say they hybridise easily, and there was actually more than one species. Yeah, I think I'm going to get our local willow person, Steve Pickup, to have a look at the willows we used, but at the moment we don't know.
And what depth was the grass mulch laid down? Emma, that one's, I guess, for you. Oh, you're on mute, Emma, sorry.
Yeah, it really wasn't very thick at all. Tilly probably remembers it was weighed out. I think it was a bucket worth per 2 metre squared. Does that sound about right? Yeah, it wasn't very thick, and it was one mulch. That's all. I think 2 weeks after planting, so it was just a leaf emergence.
It's probably about 3 centimetres, do you think?
Yeah,
Yes.
if that. Yeah, it wasn't any more than 3 centimetres.
And it was fresh. It was fresh
Yeah.
rather than dried.
Yeah, because we've had quite a few questions just about the details of the processing methods and the associated issues. Sort of the methods of how were the pellets made? Could it be done on farm? How do you air dry? Was there a sort of could you talk a little bit more about the processing of the green manures prior to putting them on?
These would be great things to look at in a farmer lab because, with the tree leaves, it is an issue that we haven't really solved. So what we did is we cut branches of green leaves on in summer, and we laid them out to dry in the sun. And then we used, in a lot of the trials, we just used those dried alder leaves because once they're dry, you can separate them from the leaves, from the stems quite easily. But on a very large scale, that would be quite time consuming. And then Aberystwyth University made pellets for us in their pelleting machine, but we're yet to work out the kind of energy calculations of that, whether climate-wise that's a good idea. But it's probably a better idea than chicken manure pellets. But yeah, in terms of using the tree leaves, there's a few different problematic things. Like whether you want to separate the leaves from the branches because the branches have a high carbon content, or whether you could just cut the very thin green branches along with the leaves, and that would be a much simpler process, or whether the trees should actually just be the nitrogen fixers that would add more nitrogen to the whole system, and then you harvest that nitrogen within other surrounding plants, like herbaceous plants that are easier to use and move, or whether perhaps you want to combine production of ramial wood, like wood chips cut in the winter with green leafy plants in the summer. So I'd say that's quite a key issue that we want to get ideas on and think about how it could work on a larger scale.
Okay. And with the pellets, was that something that could be done on farm, or was that too complicated? It's not
quite a specialised process. Yeah, I don't know if you could have regional, pellet making centres, but there's not that many places that do it from plant material. You can buy in things like hot pellets and comfrey pellets, but we struggled to work out, I asked Agrilan at one point where they get their comfrey pellets made, and I didn't get a reply. We're not too sure where it all happens, but Abbey University have just got this experimental small-scale machine, so they did some for us.
There were couple of questions about the impact on the trees themselves and on the ecosystem, I guess, of harvesting or coppicing, and the question of whether there's an issue of nutrient mining with this approach. Nitrogen is accounted for by fixation, but other nutrients don't have an atmospheric stage. Green manures that are efficient at accessing P and K have been mentioned, but that doesn't change the fact that it is continually being displaced from one to another over time. Sorry, a long one, but if you can address that'd be great.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's like a lot of other systems. I mean, it's like cropping systems themselves, where in a field of crops are in, you're continually taking stuff off. We're only looking at nitrogen in this, and I don't know how long it would take, but at some point you would imagine that some of those other macronutrients would need to be replaced. It's a bit like harvesting woodland, coppicing a woodland and taking it away over and over again. That, I think, is reducing the P and K, and if you're taking the green leaves, maybe more so. So you might have to work out a way to make that more cyclical. I don't know if, sewage sludge or some other, biochar or some other kind of material might need to be added eventually. I don't think it would happen very quickly. When you look at things like coppice woodlands, where you are removing quite a lot of material, but it's not something we've looked at it in detail. I'm making that
a very long trial, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think it would be a very long trial, but it's interesting. You can cut things like hedges over and over and over again for quite a long time, remove quite a lot without adding anything back. So that's why I'm assuming it won't be an immediate problem, but it's definitely something to look at.
Okay. Just a quick one. Someone says that they remember that reading that California lilac ceanothus is nitrogen fixing, just something to consider. And have you trialled silage style preservation, which has been trialled on large scale in Germany with grass, so it might be more efficient earlier in the season?
No, we haven't, and I think a lot of the cut and carry green manures there's a few papers on silaging, so that's, it could be a good one to look at.
Okay, I think that's most of the questions in the chat, so I just open it up to the floor if anyone has any other questions for Chloe. Either raise your hand or go ahead. Oh, sorry, or for Emma or for Tilly either, sorry. Got any other questions? Just to remind you, you're all on mute, so if anyone is trying to talk. Okay. Oh, Chris Molyneux, go ahead.
Hi there. Yeah, I actually had a go with on a sort of like quite a large scale with a clover lay applied to a kale crop. So what I did was I actually harvested the clover lay straight through a forage harvester, straight into a muck spreader, and then spread it on the field. And it was quite handy because the forage harvester had a real fancy piece of kit, and it had one of those boxes on that actually measures everything. So actually I had the dry matter, the yield, and the crude protein from the product, and so I knew exactly what I'd applied then, and I knew, and we worked out. I said, look, we'll apply. I think we ended with it was 7 ton wet. I can't remember what the dry matter was, but anyway, and we applied one straight to the other. So every acre we took off, we then applied directly back to the thing and tried to work on that. And it worked really well because you got a really fine material and it spread really well, and you knew exactly what you'd put on, and you knew exactly how much was in it. And then it was just trying to work out. It was like Emma was saying about the grass clippings, and it suppressed the weed as well. I mean, I was quite impressed with the way it works. The problem is, and we discussed it already, you can't. It's just timing it. I got it right last year. I tried again this year, but the weather's been against me, and it didn't work. I couldn't do it in time. So that's why I'm really interested in that clove thing. But it was a really good system, and I was really impressed how fine it was and how well it spread. And it wasn't very thick either. It didn't seem, like Emma said, it didn't seem like a lot, but it was a lot of. When I did the analysis, it came out as about 100 kilo of equivalent. And I'm not an organic farmer or conventional, but I reduced my nitrogen usage considerably because of that. So it was quite impressive. Anyway, I'll shut up now. Sorry.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Chris. Nice to talk to you. And so 100 kilo of nitrogen per hectare. I mean, that's
That's correct.
Yeah. I'd have thought for a kale crop. And what did it look like? The stuff you were putting on, or was it like very, very finely chopped leaves?
It was just really finely chopped. In effect, it just came out like the silage. You know, they were obviously as though it was for silage, and it spread really well because it was a clove. It broke down quite. You know, it chopped up really fine. And then applied really well, and it was just done with the muck spreader. They just had the muck spreaders piling the stuff straight out of the silage machine straight into the muck spreader, and then just cart it and spread it. And it was really handy because they were fairly close together. Obviously, the issue is it's carting it from one place to another, and the cost of doing it. Carbon footprint of that, but that's it spread really well, and a really fine carpet. And we strip tilled into that after, because we do strip tilling as well, and we strip tilled into it very easily, and it worked really well, and I was really impressed with it. And to be honest, I'm not sure whether I'm not going to see something this year, because we cropped it again this year, and my best block of Cavolo is actually where we did that, and we put that stuff on. So I don't know, but there could be an addition this year. I haven't measured it this year, but I probably should have done. But it is looking quite good.
And would that machine take rougher plants than clover? Could it take small twigs of trees? Could it take comfrey?
I would think it would take comfrey. I don't see why it wouldn't take comfrey. I think it might struggle with. I'm not sure about sort of twigs and things, but it's surprising what those sort of machines will do. The silaging machines, they are quite robust, and they do a really fine chop. I would imagine it might struggle with sort of like, we might try it, but I don't want to destroy the machine in the process. That would be a very expensive mistake. So anyway, okay, no problem.
Brilliant, thanks, Chris. That's really interesting. And probably got time for one or two more questions. There's just one in the chat. Did you notice any more or less slugs within any of the trials? That's any of you, Chris or Emma or Chloe, or if you've all been doing. Was there a slug issue attached to this?
Not that I noticed. What about you, Emma? I mean, the dry PGMs.
Well, we were growing a potato crop. So we weren't monitoring slugs particularly. There wasn't low harvest. It might be interesting with your kale, when your results from the kale crop come in, whether they noticed any slug damage. But I think with the crops that have come in so far, it's potatoes and beetroot and things, I don't think it was a problem. When I used the grass cuttings on the perennial mulch trial, the one that got most slug damage was the biodegradable sheet mulch, and all the slugs hid under the sheeting. There wasn't a problem with the grass cuttings and slugs then.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, thank you. I don't know if it's worth Chloe, or I could share the slides with the contact details, because there may be a few questions that we've missed, or people might think of something later, and it would be great. You're welcome to get in contact with us and ask anything. And
I think Tilly's got a couple of slides just to finish off, I think, about the farmer lab. Is that right? Shall I get them up on mine?
Here, I think I can do it.
I didn't have any slides prepared. I was just going to post some links in the chat.
Oh, right at the end. Are there not a couple
Yeah,
of slides someone did right at the end?
is that showing? Because I'm sharing one now. Is that?
No, not to me.
Can anyone else see that one?
Okay, I can see. I saw that for a minute. Yeah.
Zero for a minute. There we go. Try again.
Okay. Yeah. So these are a few of the questions that we had for discussion about how to go ahead with the trials, with the Farmer Lab trials. And we were going to sort of have a bit of a discussion about this, but we're running out of time now. But I will post them to you, and we've got a questionnaire link, which would be great if you could sign up to if you're interested in proceeding with the Farmer Lab. And it'd be really good to hear from you about that.
I'll just repost that, Tilly, the questionnaire link.
Thank you.
And then if you want to get in touch, here are the contact details. We can put those in the chat as well, can't we? Do that like that. Should be able to do that in the chat, shouldn't I? Okay. Would have worked. Okay. Don't know if Becky, do you want to wrap up, or should we finish it there?
Oh, good. You're still sharing though.
I'm still sharing. I will stop sharing. There we go.
All right then, yeah, thank you so much for everybody for coming and spending an hour of your evening in this session. Please fill in that questionnaire. It's really important for us to hear your feedback on what you think would be interesting to look at, what your reservations would be about the process of creating, processing, harvesting. I've just noticed, Chris, your hand was up. I don't know if that was deliberate. Okay, we're all good. All right then, without further ado, I guess I'll just thank you all for coming, and I hope you will get in touch with any or all of us about the project that you've heard about today, and hopefully a future Field Lab.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Emma.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
And thank you for taking time out this evening to join the session. So just as a reminder, please turn off your cameras if you don't want your faces to be recorded, as we are recording this session. So please do that now.